July 1945. The clock of history seemed to pause, catching its breath. In the manicured gardens of Cecilienhof Palace in Potsdam, the world's most powerful men shaped the peace. Cameras flashed. President Truman, with a new and terrible confidence, spoke of bringing Japan to its knees. Churchill, and then Attlee, weighed the costs of empire. And Joseph Stalin, in his simple marshal's tunic, listened. He smoked his pipe, a picture of avuncular solidarity. When the question of the Far East arose, he was reassuring, almost casual. The Soviet Union would honor its pledge. It would enter the war against Japan. Mid-August, he suggested. The promise was noted, filed away. A future problem. Truman's mind was on a different kind of storm. A single bomber, a single bomb, a mushroom cloud over a desert, called Alamogordo. The atomic age had begun, and in its blinding light, all other shadows seemed to vanish. But in Moscow, in a bunker deep beneath the General Staff building, a different reality was being engineered. This was not a place of polished floors and chandeliers. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap coffee, and the electric smell of tension. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the architect of Stalingrad's defense and the rout of Germany, now faced a map of a different frontier. Manchuria, a vast, mountainous puppet state, hardened into a fortress over 14 years by the Imperial Japanese Kwantung Army, 1 million men, entrenched, fanatical, waiting. The plan on the table, August Storm, was not a battle plan. It was a magic trick, the greatest magic trick in military history. The objective was not to push, not to fight, but to dissolve the Kwantung Army in a matter of weeks. A Blitzkrieg, but a Blitzkrieg launched from a standstill across 5,000 kilometers of border. The German model, studied in blood and defeat, had been perfected here, in these rooms. Deep, independent, armored thrusts through terrain deemed impossible. Paralysis of command. Total collapse. Vasilevsky's voice was calm, hollow from fatigue. He outlined the force ratios, the axes of advance. The numbers were staggering. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers, 5,000 tanks, 28,000 guns, a terrifying concentration of force. Then came the impossible condition, the cornerstone of the entire operation. Secrecy, not operational secrecy. Total, existential silence. Colonel Artyom Semyonov, a logistics officer whose face was permanently creased from squinting at freight manifests, felt the weight of the word like a physical blow. He was not a frontline hero. He was a mover of things. And now he was being told to make the largest military deployment since the invention of the railroad disappear. To move armies from the heart of Europe to the edge of Asia without creating a single ripple in the fabric of reality. The Japanese intelligence, the Tokumuki-kan, had eyes everywhere. Spies, collaborators, signals, intercepts. They expected a buildup. They were waiting for it. The only way to win was to make them see nothing at all. The protocol was unleashed. It had a chilling, bureaucratic simplicity. It was named, in internal memos, the Ghost Army Protocol. Radio networks of entire fronts went dead. Not a single encoded squeak. For armies that lived and died by the wireless, it was like severing their central nervous system. Commanders were plunged into a pre-industrial age of communication. Orders now traveled on paper, in the locked briefcases of silent couriers on slow civilian trains. A single sentence, misdelivered, could doom 1 million men. And the trains. This was Semyonov's hell. 1,000 trains, more, were already in motion. But they were not military trains. They were designated as special freight, their manifests falsified. T-34 tanks were listed as agricultural machinery, artillery pieces as mining equipment. The trains moved only at night, creeping across the immense span of the Trans-Siberian Railway. At predetermined remote sidings, in forests or ravines, they would stop. The freight would disembark and vanish into the taiga, beneath acres of precisely sewn camouflage netting that made forests appear where there were none, that turned tank columns into rolling hillsides. By dawn, the siding would be empty, just another silent stretch of track. At the border itself, a masterpiece of deception was staged. The few divisions permanently stationed there played their part perfectly. They maintained a visible, slovenly routine. Patrols were lackadaisical. Fake, dilapidated equipment was displayed in forward positions. The message to Japanese observers was clear. This is a backwater, manned by a tired, second-rate force. All the while, in the deep rear, a colossal, sharpened steel fist was being assembled in utter silence. Stalin returned from Potsdam, his promise of mid-August hanging in the diplomatic air. It was a perfect feint, a date that felt comfortably distant. But in the bunker, Vasilevsky looked at a different calendar. The countdown was not to mid-August. It was to the moment the last ghost train unloaded, the last tank was hidden, the last radio remained silent. The storm was not pending. It was already present, a colossal breathing entity woven from shadows and steel, invisible to the world, waiting for the command to cease being a ghost and become a hurricane. The success of the entire war, the lives of 1 million men, now hinged on a single, paradoxical question. Could you hide an earthquake? Colonel Semyonov, staring at a map peppered with invisible pins, his ears ringing with the silence he had helped create, knew the answer had to be yes. The first battle of the Manchurian campaign was already over. It was the battle of perception, and it had been won not with a shot, but with a whisper. A new geography was being imposed upon the eastern reaches of the Soviet Union. It was not marked on any map, but every soldier, from marshal to private, became its citizen. This was the zone of absolute silence. It was not merely an order. It was an altered state of being, a collective holding of breath that stretched from the Urals to the Sea of Japan. For Colonel Artyom Semyonov, the architect of the vanishing, the silence was a palpable, punishing force. His headquarters was not a grand hall, but a converted railway freight car, shunted onto a forgotten siding deep in the Chita Oblast. The air inside was a stale cocktail of coal dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. His desk was a chaos of phantom documents, schedules for trains that did not officially exist, loading manifests for cargo that was militarily impossible. Each sheet was stamped with a single, chilling word: muffling or jamming. This was the operational heart of the Ghost Army protocol. His task was a monstrous puzzle. He had to synchronize the arrival of hundreds of troop trains from the west with the availability of hidden forest clearings, camouflaged marshalling yards, and nighttime unloading crews who worked by the dim glow of shrouded lanterns. A delay of 6 hours could mean a tank battalion caught in the open at dawn, their silhouette a stark betrayal against the Siberian steppe. Semyonov's mind became a living switchboard of moving parts. He slept in 20-minute increments, jerked awake by the internal terror of a single hypothetical collision. A supply train carrying artillery shells meeting a passenger train on a single-track line. A catastrophic domino effect of exposure. The silence manifested in ways that frayed human nerves. At a forward airfield near Spask-Dalny, Senior Lieutenant Kira Volkova, a signals officer, presided over a bank of dead radios. Her job, once a cacophony of encrypted chatter, was now to maintain their absolute muteness. She would turn on the receivers at scheduled intervals, her headphones clamping onto a void. No familiar Morse code, no distorted voices, just the profound, hissing emptiness of the ether. That hiss became an enemy. In it, her imagination conjured phantom transmissions, Japanese direction finders zeroing in on her very thermal signature. The silence was not an absence of sound. It was a pressure, a scream held inside. One night, a rookie operator, driven mad by the quiet, keyed his microphone to whisper a test signal. The transgression was discovered in minutes. The man was not court-martialed. He simply disappeared from the base before sunrise, a stark lesson absorbed by every trembling soul in the barracks. On the ground, the infantry lived in a world of shadows and constraints. 1,000,000 men learned to move as one vast, silent organism. Digging fortifications was forbidden. The fresh earth would be visible from the air. Cooking fires were banned. Hot food came from field kitchens miles behind the lines, transported in thermoses that bled no smoke. Smoking outside after dark was punishable. The glow of a single cigarette, it was drilled into them, could be seen from a Japanese observation post 10 kilometers away. Soldiers communicated with hand signals, developed during brutal training. They laid their equipment on canvas strips to muffle any clink of metal on metal. They became experts in reading the body language of their platoon, a subtle tilt of the head, a shift in posture, replacing shouted commands. They were turning from an army into a phantom limb of the state. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence in the bustling city of Harbin, the nerve center of the Kwantung Army, was parsing a reality carefully manufactured for them. Their agents along the border reported a curious tranquility. Soviet patrols were lazy, their uniforms sometimes threadbare. They saw the same old BT-5 tanks on rail flats. Machines they knew were obsolete. Aerial reconnaissance photos, studied under magnifying glasses, showed no new trench lines, no fresh vehicle parks, no telltale scarring of earth that would betray mass movement. The Soviet rail network, they knew, was busy, but their analysts, working from a mindset of imperial certainty, concluded it was mere economic activity, or perhaps a rotation of depleted garrison troops. The concept that an entire front, with the logistical footprint of a small civilization, was being assembled just outside their field of view was cognitively rejected. It defied the logic of war as they understood it. The silence was not interpreted as a threat, but as confirmation of Soviet weakness and distraction. The Kwantung Army's own plans remained offensive, dreaming of a preemptive strike into Siberia, a fantasy nourished by the void the Soviets had created. Back in his freight car, Colonel Semyonov received the daily reports. They were hand-delivered by a courier on a bicycle, the paper damp with the man's sweat. Each report was a ledger of nothing happening. Sector 7. No incidents, no visual contacts, acoustic monitoring negative. Sector 12. All units in prescribed hide positions. No signals traffic detected or emitted. This was his scoreboard. Victory was measured in negatives. The tension was a live wire strung across thousands of kilometers. It vibrated in the tremor of a young sentry's hand, in the clenched jaw of a tank commander, watching his precious T-34 sink slowly into the mud of a hidden bog, knowing he could not call for a recovery vehicle. It lived in the eyes of General Vasilevsky himself, who toured the hidden assembly areas not in a staff car, but on horseback, a quieter beast. He saw armies materializing out of the forests at dusk, practiced and ghostly, only to dissolve again at first light. He was witnessing the birth of a weapon of perfect surprise. But he also knew its terrible fragility. The zone of absolute silence was a soap bubble, beautiful and monstrous. A single popped seam, a stray flare, a crashed plane, a traitor's whisper, would bring the entire illusion shattering down, leaving his forces caught half-formed and vulnerable in the open. The Manchurian border in late July 1945 became the quietest place on Earth. It was a quiet forged from iron discipline and existential dread. It was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a drawn bowstring, holding 1,000,000 tons of steel, pulled to its absolute limit, waiting for the signal to release. The true battlefield of the Manchurian operation was not the plains of Harbin or the peaks of the Greater Khingan. It was the 9,000-kilometer steel spine of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Here, in a moving world of steam, iron, and shadows, the war was won before a single shot was fired. This was the domain of the Phantom Express, a logistical ballet conducted in absolute darkness, a feat that defied not only the Japanese, but the very laws of probability. Colonel Semyonov's freight car headquarters had become a pulsating, nerve-racked brain. The maps on his walls were no longer static. They were dynamic, living things. Strings of colored pins, connected by taut threads, crawled across the map like slow-motion constellations. Each pin was a train, a living entity with a number, a cargo of souls and steel, and a terrifyingly narrow window of existence. The pins moved only at night. By day, they vanished from the map, representing trains hidden in tunnels, disguised as stationary freight in giant marshalling yards, or simply halted in the endless, concealing forest. The human machinery of this Phantom Express was an army of the unsung and the invisible. The most critical man in the Soviet Union was no longer Stalin or Vasilevsky. For the duration of this journey, it was the anonymous locomotive engineer on train 4071. His name was Pyotr, a veteran of the Steel Road, with 40 years of soot in his lungs. His orders were not on paper. They were whispered to him at dusk by a political officer who then boarded the train, a silent guardian. Pyotr's manifest said he was hauling timber from Sverdlovsk to a depot near Chita. In reality, his 40 wagons carried disassembled Katyusha rocket launchers and the specially trained guardsmen of a rocket artillery battalion. His job was to maintain a precise, agonizingly slow average speed, to arrive at a specific unmarked siding within a 15-minute window, in total blackout. One missed cue, one delayed switch, and the entire hidden schedule for 100 trains behind him would collapse. He drove by instinct, by the feel of the tracks, the smell of the wind, seeing only the briefest glimpse of the starlit taiga when the coal fire flared. He was piloting a continent through its own darkness. The cargo itself underwent a metamorphosis. At departure points in Europe, tanks and self-propelled guns were stripped of all unit markings, their serial numbers painted over with temporary, meaningless codes. Canvas covers were sewn to make a T-34 look, from the air, like a bulky agricultural vehicle or a pile of hay. Soldiers, the human cargo, traveled in converted boxcars marked "Nye fresh air" or "Do-I-O-A-D-A" repair crews. They were forbidden to look out of the small, slatted windows. For the 2-week journey, they lived in a rolling, claustrophobic limbo. They played cards by flashlight, wrote letters they knew would be posted only after the war began, and listened to the hypnotic, punishing rhythm of the wheels. They were men, without a present, hurtling towards an unknown future, their only purpose to remain non-existent for the duration of the trip. The danger of exposure was constant and multifaceted. In major junctions like Novosibirsk or Krasnoyarsk, where Japanese agents were known to operate, a diabolical countermeasure was employed: the mirror train. As a vital military echelon would be secretly routed onto a remote spur, an identical-looking train of empty or garbage-filled wagons, bearing the same falsified number, would roll into the main station on schedule. It would perform a pantomime of loading and unloading under the watchful eyes of any observer, a decoy absorbing all scrutiny while its priceless double slipped away into the night. For Senior Lieutenant Kira Volkova, transferred temporarily to a mobile signals unit, the Phantom Express was a journey through a spectrum of fear. Her train carried a fragile, precious cargo, a fully operational radio regiment headquarters. The equipment was powered down, dormant, but its mere presence was a bomb. Her duty was to guard the coffin, the lead-lined wagon containing the cipher machines and code books. She slept with her sidearm on her chest, not out of bravery, but because the weight of the pistol was the only tangible reminder of reality in this disorienting, rolling void. The silence outside was now compounded by the silence within the machine. It was a deafening, pressurized hollowness. Meanwhile, at the receiving end, in the forests beyond Chita, the miracle of materialization occurred nightly. As a train ghosted into a hidden siding, figures would emerge from the trees. Not soldiers, but silent, efficient phantoms. They were the unloaders, a special brigade whose sole skill was the art of silent, rapid disembarkation. Using greased ramps and felt-padded blocks, they would offload trucks, guns, and tanks without a single loud metal-on-metal shriek. The vehicles, their engines muffled with extra insulation, would then be driven not on roads, but along predetermined paths through the forest, their tracks meticulously swept away by a following detail with pine branches. By first light, the siding would be empty, the train would be gone, and the forest would swallow another 1,000 men and their machines as if they had never been. Colonel Semyonov received the nightly telegrams, a non-electronic secure line of couriers on motorcycles. Each message was a single line. Echelon B-44 assimilated. Echelon T-19 assimilated. The word arrived was forbidden. Assimilated was the term. It meant the train had been absorbed by the taiga. Its cargo had become one with the silence, a new cell in the growing, invisible body of the army. The Trans-Siberian Phantom Express was more than a supply line. It was a temporal and spatial paradox. It was a river of men and material flowing backwards in time, from the victory in Europe to the yet unbegun war in Asia. It was a collective act of will so immense it bent the physical reality of the Soviet Union. Every silent click of the rails, every held breath in a darkened boxcar, every perfectly timed switch maneuver was a stitch in the fabric of the coming storm. The war would be short and violent because this journey, this monumental feat of hidden endurance, had already been the long, silent, and brutal first battle. While the Phantom Express poured its silent cargo into the deep taiga, a meticulously staged play unfolded along the 1,000-mile frontier. This was the second psychological front of Operation August Storm, a theater where the primary weapons were deception, appearance, and the targeted cultivation of enemy arrogance. If the rear areas were a hive of hidden strength, the border itself was a carefully curated museum of Soviet weakness. The duty of maintaining this illusion fell to the permanent border garrisons, a mix of weary veterans and raw recruits who had spent the war watching the great drama unfold in the West. Now, they were thrust into the spotlight as actors in a deadly farce. Their commander, Major Grigory Borodin, a man with a limp from the Finnish War, understood his role with cynical clarity. He was not to defend the border. He was to perform its vulnerability. His orders were perverse in their detail. Patrols were to be visibly lax. Soldiers were instructed to let their uniforms appear unkempt, to shamble rather than march. Shiny boots were a violation of the deception protocol. At observation posts, they used obsolete pre-war binoculars, making a show of straining to see, while Japanese counterparts across the river noted their pathetic equipment with contempt. The few artillery pieces in forward positions were relics from the 1930s, their barrels deliberately left unoiled to show a thin coat of rust. The message was unambiguous. This was a forgotten front, manned by the dregs of the Red Army. To sell the lie, Borodin orchestrated a grand, visible failure. He ordered the construction of a new shallow trench line, a project executed with conspicuous sloppiness. The work was done in daylight, with much noise and little progress. After a week, the project was abandoned, leaving a sad, ragged scar on the earth, a symbol of Soviet incompetence and lack of resources. Japanese intelligence photographed it extensively. The images landed on desks in Harbin, where analysts nodded, their preconceptions confirmed. The Soviets, bled white by the war in Europe, lacked the will and the means to fortify their far eastern border. The masterpiece of the deception, however, was the staged relief of a frontline unit. In a move calculated to be observed, a battalion of Borodin's men was marched away from the border in broad daylight. They moved slowly, dragging their feet, a column of defeatism. To replace them, a fresh unit arrived. But it was the same battalion, having circled through the rear. They wore different, but equally shabby uniforms, and carried deliberately antiquated Mosin Nagant rifles instead of the modern SVTs they actually trained with. To the Japanese watchers, it was a perfect snapshot of a dysfunctional system, pulling out tired troops and replacing them with an equally poorly equipped green reserve. The concept that this was a deliberate pantomime and that 20 miles behind this pathetic display lay 3 fresh tank armies was a cognitive leap the Kwantung Army's intelligence was structurally incapable of making. In Harbin, Colonel Tanaka of the Tokumu Kikan pieced together the mosaic. His agents' reports were consistent: lax discipline, old equipment, no new construction of military significance. His own aerial reconnaissance showed empty steppes and quiet forests. The heavy rail traffic deep inside the USSR, he filed it under economic activity and post-war redeployment of industry. His assessment, delivered to the Kwantung Army Command, was a masterpiece of mirror imaging. He saw not an absence of threat, but a confirmation of Soviet strategic exhaustion. He argued that Stalin, having secured his European gains, would be cautious in the East, preferring diplomacy. The border's quiet weakness was not a mask, but the true face of Soviet intentions. The Kwantung Army, imbued with the cult of the offensive, began to actively discuss plans not for defense, but for a potential limited strike into Soviet territory, should diplomacy fail, a plan predicated on the enemy's perceived fragility. Back at his forward command post, Major Borodin watched the Japanese observers through his own, secretly powerful, scopes. He saw their relaxed posture, their occasional lack of discipline. He felt the creeping, dangerous success of his own charade. The illusion was perfect. It was also a hair-trigger trap. His men, playing the role of weaklings, were in a position of genuine, terrifying vulnerability. If the Japanese decided to test the fiction with a sudden raid, his understrength, theatrically demoralized battalion would be wiped out in minutes, and the entire careful timetable of the hidden offensive could be shattered. He received a visit from a grim-faced political officer who handed him a sealed packet. Inside were orders for the final act. In the 48 hours before H-hour, Borodin was to increase the visible decay, send patrols out drunk, stage a minor mutiny in a mess hall, allow a truck to break down and be abandoned in no man's land. The goal was to paint a picture of an army on the brink of collapse, its command structure dissolving. This was the highest risk phase. It required his men to balance on a razor's edge, projecting chaos while maintaining ironclad internal discipline, ready to snap from feigned incompetence to lethal efficiency in a heartbeat. The tension within Borodin's garrison became a physical sickness. The soldiers, in on the grand deceit, lived with a dual reality. By day, they were slovenly, bored, and harmless. By night, in the blacked-out barracks, they sharpened knives, cleaned the modern weapons hidden in locked armories, and studied maps of the very Japanese positions they pretended to fear. The psychological toll was immense. Playing a coward is corrosive to the soul. Many began to question which version of themselves was real. The border in the first days of August 1945 became a surreal, silent stage. On one side, the Japanese, confident, disdainful, planning offensives based on a mirage. On the other, the Soviets, a masterfully painted portrait of decay, behind which pulsed the coiled spring violence of a million invisible men. The illusion of weakness was not just a tactic. It was a weapon of mass disorientation. It had persuaded the enemy to write his own defeat narrative, to lay his head comfortably on the chopping block, utterly convinced the blade did not exist. The success of the coming Blitzkrieg now depended on this single, fragile, and brilliantly maintained lie, holding for just a few more days. While the border pantomime played out and the Phantom Express completed its final silent runs, the true shape of the coming storm was being forged in a series of hidden command posts buried deep in the forest. This was not about mass anymore. It was about velocity, geometry, and the surgical application of overwhelming force. Marshal Vasilevsky and his commanders were not planning a battle. They were designing a catastrophic system failure for the entire Kwantung Army. The intellectual heart of this effort was a converted hunter's lodge, its windows perpetually shuttered, illuminated only by the cold glow of map tables and the embers of endless cigarettes. Here, the doctrine of the Soviet deep operation, perfected in the brutal crucible of the Eastern Front, was being refined to an even sharper point. The man tasked with translating this theory into a workable blade was General Pavel Belov, commander of the newly formed First Far Eastern Front. A veteran of the great tank battles at Kursk, Belov understood that the Japanese, for all their fanaticism in defense, were mentally unprepared for the specific kind of mechanized hell he was about to unleash. The core insight was psychological as much as tactical. The Kwantung Army was strong, but it was a static strength. Its defenses were linear, designed to meet and blunt a traditional frontal assault. Its mentality was that of the duel, two forces meeting head-on. Bailov's plan was that of the surgeon and the saboteur combined. He would not attack the body. He would sever its nerves and collapse its skeleton. Spread across the map were not arrows indicating broad advances, but a series of slender, terrifyingly deep thrusts labeled mobile groups. These were not full armies, but concentrated fists of armor and mechanized infantry, stripped of slow-moving support units. Their composition was ruthless. A corps of the new, faster T-34-85 tanks, regiments of self-propelled guns, truck-borne submachine gunners, and dedicated battalions of combat engineers. Their job was not to fight through fortified regions, but to bypass them entirely, ignoring their flanks, and plunge into the deep operational rear of Manchuria. The key to this was the terrain itself. Bailov's staff had identified what Japanese generals considered impassable barriers: the snarled, rugged peaks of the Greater Khingan Mountains, the trackless bogs of the Argun River Basin, the waterless stretches of the Gobi Desert's fringe. These were not obstacles. They were avenues. The Japanese had left them lightly guarded, if at all, trusting nature to hold the line. Bailov's mobile groups would use them as their private highways, achieving the one thing the enemy believed impossible: strategic surprise from a direction he deemed irrelevant. In a hidden valley, a specialized brigade was training for this very nightmare. Their commander, Captain Leonid Warshawski, was an engineer who had learned his trade-clearing German minefields under fire. Now, his men practiced a different craft: the creation of armies from nothing. They trained with Japanese maps and captured equipment, learning to rebuild blown bridges in hours using prefabricated components, to lay corduroy roads across swamps in a single night, to find potable water in the desert using ancient, forgotten methods passed down by Mongol guides. Warshawski's men were the unsung enablers of the Blitzkrieg. Without them, the lightning would ground itself in mud and logistical collapse. Parallel to this, in a soundproofed cellar beneath a ruined monastery, a different kind of warfare was being planned. A young, intense major from Smersh, codenamed Korsakov, oversaw the Special Tasks roster. His targets were not armies, but the means of command. Using intelligence from partisans and covert agents, his teams had identified the key communication nodes of the Kwantung Army: field telephone exchanges, radio relay stations, even the courier horse trails between headquarters. Their mission, to be executed in the chaotic first minutes of the invasion, was not destruction, but simultaneous, paralyzing seizure. Paratroopers and disguised Spetsnaz teams would capture these nodes intact, allowing Soviet signals troops to patch themselves into the Japanese command network. The goal was to hear the enemy's panic in real time and feed him false orders to turn his own nervous system against him. Bailov presented the finalized plan to Vasilevsky. It was a thing of chilling elegance. The initial bombardment would not be a prolonged drum fire to soften up the front lines. It would be a short, annihilating hurricane against the tactical headquarters and communication centers just behind the border, a decapitation strike. Then, before the dust settled, The mobile groups would launch. They would not attack. They would transit. Their objective was not the enemy soldier in his bunker, but the empty space hundreds of kilometers behind him. Their goal was to reach the central Manchurian plain and pivot, not to capture cities, but to sever the Kwantung Army's logistical arteries and encircle its disparate components in giant, disconnected pockets. The fortified regions, bereft of command, supplies, and hope, would wither on the vine. Vasilevsky approved it with a single, slow nod. He saw the beauty and the monstrous risk. The entire plan was a high-wire act. It banked everything on speed and shock. If the mobile group stalled, if the engineers failed, if the Japanese recovered their wits faster than anticipated, the overextended Soviet spearheads would be isolated and destroyed in the depths of Manchuria. It was a plan that could result in either a historic victory or a historic catastrophe within the span of 72 hours. The final briefings were held not in rooms, but in the open air of the hidden assembly areas, under the cover of darkness. Tank commanders traced their routes on maps lit by hooded flashlights. The routes did not stop at the border. They extended deep into the interior, to places with strange musical names: Hailar, Chikihar, Mudanjiang. The soldiers, finally seeing the gargantuan scale of the operation, understood. They were not being sent to fight a line. They were being sent to collapse a world. The tension now transformed from the anxiety of waiting into the focused, kinetic energy of a predator coiling its muscles. The anatomy of the lightning was complete. Every component, from the strategic genius of Belov to the sweating engineer with his bridge girders, from the radio saboteur to the tank driver memorizing desert landmarks, was now a single integrated circuit. All that was required was the switch to be thrown, to release the stored energy of a month of silence and deception in one cataclysmic discharge. The night of August 8, 1945 was not silent. It was pregnant with a sound below the threshold of hearing, a subsonic hum of 1,000,000 heartbeats, synchronized by a single, imminent event. In his rolling command post, a heavily armored train hidden in a mountain tunnel, Marshal Vasilevsky watched the final seconds drain away. He did not give a speech. He simply looked at the faces of his staff, pale in the lamplight, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The nod traveled down wires, to couriers on motorcycles, to runners in trenches, to radio operators who, for the first time in weeks, pressed their transmit keys. The first sound of the storm was not a weapon. It was the rustle of canvas being torn away from thousands of gun barrels. It was the deafening roar of tank engines, uncorked and unleashed after weeks of muffled idleness, flooding the silent forests with a wave of mechanical thunder. It was the collective gasp of a giant awakening. At precisely E010 on August 9th local time, the sky tore open. The initial barrage was not a traditional artillery preparation. It was a neurological strike. Based on Korsakov's Special Tasks intelligence, the first shells to scream through the darkness were not aimed at frontline trenches. They were high-explosive and radio-jamming projectiles that walked with methodical fury through the Japanese tactical command zone, 5 to 10 kilometers behind the border. Field telephone exchanges vanished in geysers of dirt and wire. Radio antennas were bent into surreal sculptures by concussive waves. Regiment and battalion headquarters, where staff officers were still interpreting the sudden roar from the front as a localized raid, were simply erased. The command spine of the Kwantung Army's forward units was shattered in the first 5 minutes. Before the Japanese forward observers could even begin to call in coordinates for counter-battery fire, a process now impossible, the ground began to shake with a deeper, more rhythmic tremor. From their hidden forest lairs, the mobile groups emerged. This was the moment Captain Warshawski's engineers had labored for. Where maps showed impassable terrain, temporary bridges now spanned rivers, their surfaces still echoing with the hammer blows of their construction. Through mountain passes considered suitable only for pack animals, columns of T-34s now crawled, their drivers navigating by shielded headlights that cast narrow cones of light on the sheer rock walls. Major Grigory Borodin's border garrison underwent a metamorphosis so rapid it was terrifying to behold. The slovenly, demoralized troops vanished. In their place, emerging from hidden bunkers and camouflaged weapon pits, were assault battalions in fresh uniforms, their faces smeared with grease paint, their PPSH submachine guns loaded. They did not advance in waves. They infiltrated like poison, using the chaos of the barrage to slip through the gaps in the Japanese line, not to kill the defenders in their bunkers, but to bypass them and mark them for the follow-up infantry that was already moving up. Borodin himself stood upright in his command post, no longer limping, barking coordinates into a radio that was now gloriously, lethally alive. The Japanese response was a study in catastrophic disorientation. In forward bunkers, soldiers manned their machine guns, firing into the darkness at phantom shapes, waiting for the mass infantry assault that never came. The expected human tide was replaced by the roaring, invisible torrent of the mobile groups racing past them, deeper into the Manchurian night. At higher headquarters, the reports that did arrive were fragments of madness. Enemy tanks in our rear. Communications with 7th Division lost. We are surrounded. Many of these reports were false, engineered by Korsakov's saboteurs, who had captured signal stations and were now broadcasting panic in flawless Japanese. The storm did not move. It flowed. It flowed around strongpoints. It flowed through valleys the Japanese had left unguarded. It flowed with a speed that rendered traditional defensive concepts obsolete. Soviet aviation, unchallenged in the now disrupted skies, did not engage in dogfights. It became flying artillery for the spearheads, striking at crossroads, supply dumps, and any attempt to form a coherent defensive line ahead of the advancing armor. In Harbin, dawn brought not clarity, but a crescendo of terror. Colonel Tanaka of the Tokumu Kikan stood in his map room, the pins and flags representing his units now meaningless. The front line, a concept he had worshipped, had ceased to exist. Instead, there were only frantic, isolated reports of Soviet forces appearing hundreds of kilometers behind where the front line was supposed to be. The map was no longer a tool of understanding. It was a document of surrealist horror. The weak, disorganized enemy of his careful reports had been a phantom. The real enemy was a multi-headed hydra, already coiled around the vital organs of the Kwantung Army, before the army even knew it was in a fight. For the men of the mobile groups, the experience was one of surreal, exhausting momentum. They fought not against armies, but against time, distance, and mechanical failure. A tank battalion commander, his voice raw over the radio, reported not engaging enemy tanks, but crossing the greater Kingen Range, an achievement his Japanese counterparts would have dismissed as a physical impossibility. The enemy they saw were not combat troops, but bewildered logistics units, administrative staff fleeing in trucks, and the occasional futile roadblock manned by military police. The greatest resistance came from the land itself, a bog that swallowed a half-track, a collapsed mountain track, a dust storm in the desert that blinded entire columns. By the end of that first unimaginable day, the surgical blueprint of Belov's plan had been etched in fire and movement across the face of Manchuria. The Kwantung army was not being defeated in battle. It was being systematically dismembered. Its limbs, its isolated divisions in fortified regions, were cut off from the body. Its nerves, its communications, were severed. Its brain, its high command in Changchun, was paralyzed, receiving news of disasters that had already happened hours ago. The lightning strike had not merely hit, it had bypassed the skin and skeleton to fry the central nervous system. The storm was no longer coming. It was everywhere at once. The Blitzkrieg was a masterpiece on the map, a sweeping ballet of arrows and encirclements. But on the ground, in the smoke-choked valleys and the sun-baked plains of Manchuria, it was a brutal, intimate, and morally corrosive affair. The Soviet storm, for all its strategic perfection, now collided with the jagged human reality of a cornered and fanatical enemy. The price of lightning was paid in blood, fear, and moments of horrific, close-quarters savagery. While the mobile groups slashed into the deep rear, the grim, unglamorous work of reducing the bypassed Japanese fortified regions fell to the follow-up infantry armies. These were not the glamorous tank riders, but the foot soldiers, the artillerymen, the flamethrower operators. For them, the lightning war had stopped. It had become a siege, a trench war in miniature, fought against an enemy who had been ordered to hold their positions to the last man, and who took the order as a sacred vow. Captain Warshawski's engineers, who had built roads for the lightning, now found their skills turned to a darker purpose, breaking open concrete and steel. At the fortified complex of Hutu, a labyrinth of underground tunnels and pillboxes overlooking the Amur River, the advance stalled. Soviet infantry charges were cut down by interlocking fields of fire from positions carved into the very rock. The Blitzkrieg's elegant bypass was meaningless here. This poison pill had to be swallowed. Warshawski's men, under relentless machine gun fire, used demolition charges and armored bulldozers to seal ventilation shafts and primary entrances, turning the fortress into a collective tomb. Through listening devices, they could hear the desperate sounds from within, shouts, prayers, the screams of the wounded as oxygen grew thin. It was not a battle. It was a forced suffocation. The victory, when the last embrasure fell silent, left the attackers not exhilarated, but hollow and ash-stained. Elsewhere, the fanaticism took a more active, terrifying form. Isolated Japanese units, realizing they were cut off and that the Soviet advance was flowing around them, launched desperate nighttime counterattacks. These were not tactical maneuvers, but suicidal charges born of samurai spirit and the code of Bushido. Waves of soldiers, often led by officers wielding only swords, hurled themselves at Soviet positions, their screams cutting through the rattle of machine guns. They were mowed down in windrows, their bodies piling up in grotesque formations. The psychological impact on the young Soviet conscripts was profound. They had been prepared for a war of movement, for defeating an enemy through maneuver. They were not prepared for this eerie, sacrificial rage. It felt less like fighting soldiers and more like trying to stop a force of nature, a tsunami of flesh and bone. In the chaotic rear of the speeding Soviet columns, a different kind of war erupted. Stragglers, breakouts, and dedicated infiltrator squads, the Gaitai, engaged in guerrilla-style terror. They ambushed medical convoys, targeting the Red Crosses with cold precision. They attacked lone supply trucks, strangling the delicate logistical tail that fed the lightning. A young Soviet nurse, who had volunteered for the front believing the war in Europe had hardened her to anything, found herself dragging wounded men into a ditch as bullets snapped overhead from an invisible enemy in a field of Kaoliang. The enemy here had no face, no front line. The paradise of speed had created pockets of pure anarchic violence in its wake. For Colonel Tanaka in Harbin, the human price was measured in the disintegration of certainty. His pristine maps were now defaced with frantic, contradictory reports. He received a message from a surrounded garrison commander, not requesting reinforcements, but politely inquiring about the overall strategic situation, as if this were a staff exercise. The message ended mid-sentence. Tanaka never learned if the transmission was cut by a shell or by the commander's own death. The Kwantung Army's leadership, bred in a culture of unthinking obedience and offensive spirit, was mentally unequipped for this reality. Orders continued to be issued to units that no longer existed, demanding attacks along axes that were already 70 kilometers behind enemy lines. The breakdown was not just logistical, it was psychological, a shattering of the very worldview that had built the army. Amidst the chaos, moments of bizarre humanity flickered. A Soviet tank column, racing towards a key town, came across a stranded Japanese field hospital, its doctors still tending to wounded under a red sun flag. The tank commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where such a scene would have been unthinkable, made a split-second decision. He ordered his column to halt, provided the doctors with captured medical supplies from a previous engagement, and then moved on, leaving the hospital untouched. It was an act not of doctrine, but of exhausted humanity, a tiny oasis of mercy in the desert of total war. Conversely, there were reports of Soviet soldiers enraged by the sight of mutilated comrades from a Gaitai ambush, giving no quarter in the next engagement. The storm was winning, but it was getting stained. The beautiful, clean lines on Belov's map were now smudged with the ugly, necessary compromises of annihilation. The speed that had been their greatest weapon also meant there was no time to properly clear the territory, to process prisoners, to tend to all the wounds inflicted. The operation was a stunning success, but it was a success written in two languages: the clinical language of operational art and the raw, screaming vernacular of men killing and dying in confusion and terror. The lightning had revealed its true nature. It was not a clean force of nature, but a man-made cataclysm that illuminated, in its blinding flash, both the heights of military genius and the darkest depths of the human capacity for destruction and sacrifice. By August 20th, 1945, the storm had run its course. The mechanical thunder of the Blitzkrieg faded into an eerie, pervasive silence, broken only by the sporadic crackle of distant surrenders and the mournful cries of crows over abandoned battlefields. The Kwantung Army, once 1 million strong, had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. It lay in pieces, shattered divisions surrendering en masse in the mud flats of Manchuria, isolated garrisons starving in their concrete tombs, columns of dazed prisoners stretching to the horizon. The Soviet Union had achieved the militarily impossible, the total strategic defeat of a major enemy army in less than 2 weeks, with losses a fraction of what had been anticipated. But this victory arrived in a world that had already been blinded by a new, more terrifying light. For the men who had engineered the storm, the triumph was shrouded in a bitter, historical irony. In his command train, now parked on the outskirts of conquered Changchun, Marshal Vasilevsky received the final reports. The numbers were staggering. Over 600,000 Japanese prisoners taken, the enemy's entire material wealth captured. His plan, the Ghost Army Protocol, the Zone of Silence, the brutal elegance of the mobile groups, it had all worked with a precision that would be studied in war academies for a century. Yet, the congratulatory cable from Stalin felt hollow. The world's headlines were not screaming about the Manchurian Blitzkrieg. They were dominated by 2 names, Little Boy and Fat Man, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bombs had not just ended a war. They had rewritten the narrative of its ending. Vasilevsky understood. He had won the last great campaign of the Second World War, but his victory was instantly relegated to the footnotes of the new atomic age. His war, a war of human-scale genius, of logistics, deception, and brutal maneuver, was already a relic. The front page belonged to the single bomber, the single bomb, the abstract, impersonal annihilation from the heavens. Across the shattered landscape, the architects of the unseen victory grappled with this dissonance. Colonel Artyom Semyonov, in his freight car now stationary, surveyed the mountains of paperwork that documented the Phantom Express. Every train, every tank, every ton of supplies had moved like clockwork. He had conjured an army from thin air. And for what? To be a historical postscript? He closed his ledgers, the ink still fresh, knowing they would likely molder in an archive, their monumental achievement overshadowed by the brighter, more terrible fire. Major Grigory Borodin, his border garrison now a headquarters for processing prisoners, walked through a captured Japanese supply depot. His men, the actors of weakness, were now the victors, but their performance felt like a distant dream. The enemy officers he interrogated were not defiant. They were confused. Their questions were not about tactics, but about the new bomb. They had been defeated by a classical military masterpiece, but they believed they had been defeated by a scientific miracle. Borodin's perfect deception had been so effective, it had hidden its own success. For Senior Lieutenant Kira Volkova, the silence was finally over. The airwaves were now clogged with traffic, but it was the traffic of occupation, not operation. The oppressive, purposeful quiet that had driven her to the edge was gone, replaced by a chaotic din that felt equally meaningless. She had been a guardian of the void, and the void had been the key to victory. Now that the victory was won, she felt unmoored. The great, taut wire of tension that had connected her to Semyonov, to Borodin, to the millions in the zone of silence, had been cut. The shared, sacred burden was now just a memory. In a clearing in the Greater Khingan, Captain Leonid Varshavsky's engineers were not building bridges, but burning the wooden scraps of their temporary constructions. The specialized tools, the maps, the knowledge of turning impossible terrain into highways, it was all obsolete now. Their war, a war of sweat, geometry, and sheer bloody-minded ingenuity against nature and the enemy, was over. The new war, they sensed, would be against forces that made mountains and deserts irrelevant. The final, cruel twist was the nature of the peace. The Soviet Blitzkrieg had achieved its political goals with devastating efficiency. It secured the territories promised at Yalta, it reshaped the balance of power in Asia, it announced the USSR as a Pacific power. But these were geopolitical facts, not stories that captured the human imagination. The world, traumatized and awestruck, had fastened its gaze on the apocalyptic spectacle of the atom. The meticulous, human-scale cunning of August Storm was too complex, too subtle, too normal in its military brilliance to compete. The Manchurian operation faded from public consciousness, but not from history. It remained, for those who studied it, a flawless diamond of the military art, the last and perhaps greatest classical blitzkrieg, executed on a continental scale. It proved that will, organization, and audacity could still decide the fate of nations, even as the means of their ultimate destruction were being fundamentally altered. As the Soviet troops began their long journey home, they left behind a transformed Manchuria and an ambiguous legacy. They were the victors of a secret war, authors of a masterpiece most of the world would never properly see. They had pulled off the perfect illusion, and in their success, they had rendered their own form of warfare a magnificent closing chapter. The storm had been unleashed, it had devastated everything in its path, and then it had dissipated, its thunder stolen by the deeper, more profound silence of the atomic age. Their victory was total, decisive, and utterly, profoundly unseen.